Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Toop, and I have the honor to serve as the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Gelber Prize and to acknowledge an outstanding scholar and author and a great book. More later. The Gelber Prize is a literary award for the world's best nonfiction book in English on foreign affairs, and it seeks to deepen public debate on significant international issues. The Lionel Gelber Prize was founded in 1989 by Canadian diplomat Lionel Gelber, presented annually by the Lionel Gelber Foundation, and I'm very happy to welcome the trustees of the foundation, in partnership with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Foreign Policy magazine. I would like to invite now Patricia Rubin, who's niece of the late Lionel Gelber and a real champion of his work and legacy. She serves on the board of the Gelber Foundation, and she's chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board. An accomplished lawyer and a really good friend of the Munk School, it's a pleasure for me to invite Patty to tell us more about the Lionel Gelber Prize and about the remarkable milestone that we're celebrating today. Patty.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished honoree, Serhii Plokhy, winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize for 2015. And a warm welcome to you all to our annual prize lecture and ceremony. 25 years ago, we began as a Canadian prize with international aspirations, a rare bird. And so, this being our 25th anniversary, I hope you won't mind if I reflect for a moment on our intrepid beginnings and our team. Lionel Gelber devoted his life to writing, reading, and lecturing in the field of foreign affairs. In establishing this book prize, he sought to praise in a meaningful way the best books on international affairs that would be both readable and possess scholarly authority. My late father, Arthur Gelber, set the prize in motion and gave the prize its gravitas. Then my sister Nance Gelber took the reins, and her early devotion to the concept of the prize and its stature among international writers moved the prize onto the world stage. Partnering with Foreign Policy magazine introduced us to a wider audience and lectures in Washington at cherry blossom time. We next moved our operations to the Munk School, where we have been blessed with a powerhouse of thinkers, doers, and enablers under the brilliant leadership of Janice Stein. No one could have helped us achieve this significant milestone more than our wise and generous dear friend. Of course, we have had sure-footed guidance from our prize boards, past and present, many of whom are Gelber family members: Judith Gelber, Sarah Charney, Dan Bjarnason, Gerald Rubin, and Noah Rubin, but also extraordinary advisors and academics such as Stephen Cole, William Thorsell, Lou Pauly, and Ron Levy, all of whom have made their mark and have earned my gratitude. Many thanks and vast appreciation also go to Nina Borick, who administers the prize. This year, her job included producing our 25th anniversary video, which you were about to see, creating an archive at U of T for Gelber Prize memorabilia, and organizing an exhibit to be held at Robarts Library from May 11th to August 14th to mark 25 years of the Gelber Prize. Many thanks also to June Dickinson, our publicist, whose hard work has engendered the marvelous articles and interviews that you have enjoyed since the list of finalists was announced. I love being called and told to look in today's Globe for an editorial, or when I was away, being emailed that the National Post had started its 5 days of excerpts from our finalist books, or being reminded to read Olivia Ward's well-considered review of our finalists, and listening to Rob Steiner's podcast, which you can hear at our website. Thank you to you all. And a hearty welcome to the Munk School's new director, Stephen Toop. Where is Stephen? Who has shown great courtesy and wisdom in tackling his new role with our prize board. In many ways, though, our celebration today is indebted to our juries, past and present. Their dedication to the task of selecting the star that shines brighter than the others is remarkable. Stephen will introduce this year's jury, but I must single out for praise our jury chair, William Thorsell, whose understanding and mindfulness of the value of the prize encourages distinguished authors to allow their books to be submitted for consideration. My final reflections tonight are in imagining what pride my Uncle Lionel would feel that his legacy of helping us to better understand the world we live in continues triumphantly with our celebratory video entitled Looking Back, Moving Forward. Now, I must tell you that this video is only a hint of what 5 previous prize winners had to say about how the world has changed in the past 25 years. I encourage you to watch the full interviews with John Stackhouse, journalist and distinguished fellow at the Monk School, whose gentle probing has elicited their scholarly insights and provocative prognosis for a world that is, for the most part, you will hear, getting wealthier and healthier, but also more volatile. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Looking Back, Moving Forward. Thank you.
When I look back 25 years, I do remember a great optimism at that time. People living in Russia and the other former Soviet territories felt that a very different future was in front of them.
The quarter century started on a note of high hope because of a wave of democratization. But what's replaced that autocracy is often pretty dysfunctional democratic politics.
Within a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was clear that the end of international Soviet communism was going to produce a revival of religious politics, of ethnic and nationalist and separatist politics.
I remember the night the Berlin Wall fell, or the morning after, I was actually in Rio. The headline was O Triunfo do Capitalismo, the triumph of capitalism. And as I was reading this, I felt a tug at my coat. I looked down and this 4-year-old child was begging for the scraps of my breakfast. So I thought, well, you know, maybe the triumph of capitalism isn't completely finished yet.
The income gap is widening. Corporate chief executives are paid, 100 or a couple hundred times as much as their lowest paid employees.
Thanks to the internet, thanks to sort of global commerce, migration, flows of people, we're in a much more global world.
It really is astonishing, the amount of shifts that are going on at the moment.
It's almost a principle of network mathematics that when you build a system of globalization like the one we're building with computers and speed, you're going to get volatility. And we see it in the financial markets, and we see it in the rise of groups like ISIS overnight.
Both the good and the bad are at a greater amplitude. In that sense, what I think technology does to human history is it turns up the volume.
The cost of protest has fallen a lot.
If somebody's there with a cell phone and can take a picture of it, it often can reach a huge audience in a very short space of time.
Technology makes it possible to self-empower.
Technology also gives repressive governments tools to monitor their citizens' behavior.
Hardware and software, it seems to me now they're sort of overlapping. The knowledge that your communication system is being monitored by the state. And what does this do to your thinking year after year?
Information in the modern age is one of the major sources of state strength.
It's the question of our age, who wins, the authoritarian adaptation and control of these technologies, or the citizens that thought they would be empowered in a completely new way.
I can't see the future. What I see is struggles. Some will be won, some will be lost.
We need to think 100 years from now, what are people looking back at us going to judge us for?
Thank you to the Gelber Committee, because the Gelber Committee was the first prize award that the Bottomvillian won. It's since won quite a lot, but you started it.
Well, how are we all going to be judged? That's a tough question. One thing that's clear to me is that the Gelber family will be judged kindly for creating this prize and for allowing us all to share in its real intellectual delights. It's now an honor to introduce the members of the jury very, very briefly. We had an extraordinarily distinguished jury this year, led, as Patty Rubin noted, by our jury chair, William Thorsell. Many of you know William, currently a continuing fellow at Massey College, and I'm delighted to say a fellow here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Served for 10 years as editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, and then, of course, as director and CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum. Invested into the Order of Ontario and as a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters in France. And he has been an extraordinarily dedicated and hardworking chair. He was joined by Anne Applebaum, an award-winning author, journalist, historian, columnist for the Washington Post and Slate, contributor to the New Republic, to the New York Review of Books. Many of you will have read her work. Probably most famous for her book Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, as well as Britain's Duff Cooper Prize. Her most recent book, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, was nominated for a National Book Award and for the Lionel Gelber Prize. Gary Bass, professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, author of The Blood Telegram, Nixon, Kissinger, and a Forgotten Genocide, Pulitzer Prize finalist and winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize. You may know him as a former reporter for The Economist and for the New York Times. Matthias Spector, an associate professor at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, currently completing a book on U.S.-Brazil relations, also working on multi-archival research on the history of Brazil's nuclear program, a visiting fellow with the London School of Economics, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Finally, but by no means least, John Stackhouse, award-winning journalist, author, senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and the C.D. Howe Institute. Also a former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and its international development correspondent. You may remember that when he was working out of New Delhi. Author and co-author of many titles, including the best-selling work, Out of Poverty. A great jury that did a wonderful job. And now I'd like to invite the jury chair, William Thorsell, to come up and provide us with a very brief overview of the shortlisted titles. Thank you very much for your work, William.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Munk School for all the support for this process every year. It's been a pleasure, and we get 22 books or so in the middle of November, selected by, parsed by the Munk School, and then we, in different parts of the world, start reading them, and around the middle of January, we get down to 10, and then we have about another month to get down to 5 and the winner. So this is a great education is like going back to grad school for a few months in a very rich environment, intellectual environment, and so very well done. Lionel Gelber emphasized that one of the purposes of the prize was to expand public interest and appreciation for international affairs, and so therefore we like to give a lot of publicity to our long list of 10, our short list of 5, and so I'm just going to give you a sense of the short list of 5 here. And we had a wonderful couple of hours on the phone in January from all over the world discussing these books before we got to the winner. By Jack Fairweather, The Good War. This is a book on the Afghanistan war since 2001, which really makes for fairly depressing reading in the sense that it points to the naivete of the war, the vague purposes of the war, the wasteful way it was done, the incompetence that just barely was able to be masked by guns and speeches, and ultimately the uncertain outcome, which today, of course, remains uncertain. So it is a cautionary tale about no exit strategies, no clear aims, and very poor execution. And we seem to need this tale to be told every decade or so before we start another one of these escapades. A very fine read about a very sad outcome. My Promised Land, Ari Shavit. This is a book it's a hard-telling tale, big-hearted book about Israel. And he comes to the story of what you might almost call, what he would call the tragedy, in a sense, of Israel, still unfolding, uncertain, through storytelling, and the storytelling right back to the 1940s and up to the present day from different angles, not judgmental, but revealing, and leaves us with a sense of this enormous question hanging over the future of Israel, which of course has come up again recently in the elections, and leaves us with no sense of where the resolution is, of course, because we really don't know where that is. This is a wonderfully humane and informed read by a man who has been part of that story from the beginning. I highly recommend that one as well. Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, Faith, and New China by Evan Osnos. He's a journalist who has been living in China. This is not a book about the Communist Party. It's not a book about the government of China or the economy of China. It's a book about the Deng Xiaoping generation. It's a book about the people that have grown up in the new open China. Who are these people that are the new Chinese class, if you will? They are naive, they're very resourceful, they're very materialistic, they are very peripatetic, they are not often very questioning, they are confused, and they're very interesting and very, very attractive in some senses, in a sense because of their innocence to a degree, as a new generation in a new status quo. So this is sociology, this is character description en masse, and these are hundreds of millions of people who are just getting to know themselves in a new context, and whom we are destined to get to know soon as they take over in the future from the original people. 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright. This is about the 4 days that became 13 days at Camp David when President Carter, Begin, and Sadat went up to the mountain, if you will, to find peace between Israel and Egypt. And this becomes sort of like it's almost like reality TV. Every chapter is another day, and you get into the new day, and all of the foibles of humanity come to the fore: jealousy, insecurity, resentment, fear, I would even say selfishness, and then it almost falls apart, and then day 4, when it's supposed to be over, becomes day 5, and we finally get to day 13, where after they're getting so tired of that pizza, so tired of that beer, and so tired of sitting around their cabins, they finally give in and sign an agreement whose ink is barely survives drying before the whole agreement starts to fall apart. And ultimately, the last chapter here is poor Jimmy Carter leaving Israel in a snit after the success, and you may have read today he's back there and he's being shunned. So this is a part of an ongoing story as well. Of course, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union by Serhiy Plokhy. Well, the final days of the Soviet Union in a sense, aren't over, because this book is like it's a page turner, if you will. 4 months at the end of the Soviet Union, where so many uncertainties, so many dangers, so many lost opportunities came and went in a matter of days at huge stakes, with the American White House intervening very much with Gorbachev and with Yeltsin directly playing a role in this, and then through the exploitation of many new and very important sources, we understand much more about the decisive role of Ukraine in determining the outcome, and then also the response of Yeltsin to the fact that he's actually going to lose Ukraine. It's not, there isn't going to be a Soviet Union. And in my mind, what stuck out so much was him thinking to himself, gee, we should get Crimea and the Donbass back before we let them go. But we kind of missed that moment at the time. So this book is a fresh and wonderful history, but it is also essential to really comprehend the dynamics of what is happening, perhaps the greatest geopolitical event of our time at the moment in Europe and Russia and Ukraine and all it means. So thank you to the Gelber Prize for bringing all these books, and the other remaining ones you can see on the website. These are worth your time, they're worth your intelligence, and I very much recommend every one of them to you, and particularly the winner. Thank you.
Well, we've arrived at the moment that we've all been waiting for since we first got here, which is to hear from the prize winner. I just want to mention that there will be a very brief question and answer period after the lecture, and there will be some cards, little index cards sent around here for anyone who would like one. I can promise you we will not be able to get to all the questions simply because of pressures of time, but I do encourage you, if you want to pose a question, to write it out on a card, and we'll do our best. So our guest of honor today is Serhiy Plokhy, who is the Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University. He is a leading authority on the wider region, author of numerous books, including The Origins of the Slavic Nations and Yalta, The Price of Peace, which was a finalist in 2011 for the Lionel Gelber Prize. We've heard already about the last empire, the final days of the Soviet Union. He's going to tell us in a little more detail the nature of the argument in what is a tremendous book. And I will conclude simply by noting that it is also nominated for the Pushkin House Prize in London. Please join me in warmly welcoming Serhiy Plokhy.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. Thank you to the members of the jury, to the Lionel Gelber Foundation, to the Munk School. I am really very happy to be here. Lionel Gelber is an international prize, but with big Canadian heart. And I'm really very happy to be back in Canada. I came here for the first time in the middle of the coup in Moscow. It was in August of 1991, and I then stayed here for 15 quite happy years at the University of Alberta, working on a number of projects, some of them funded and supported by Peter Jacek Educational Foundation. And I would like to take this opportunity also to thank visionaries who support scholarship through Gelber Prize, through the programs that were established by Jacek Foundation. The prize was established in 1989, 1990, and this wonderful movie, wonderful documentary, talked about high expectations, the optimism of the period. The Berlin Wall was down. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Nations like Ukraine and Latvia and Estonia and Armenia were celebrating their independence. Now we are 20, 24, 25 years later in a very different situation, in a very different environment, And the question that many ask is, what went wrong? There is a number of ways to answer this question, looking at economics, looking at politics, looking at international relations. But one of most productive, surprise, surprise, to hear from a historian is certainly to look back at the events of that time and maybe try to find answers to our today's questions. There are two, as far as I am concerned, dominant narratives of the history of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War. The first one is that the Soviet collapse was coterminous with the end of the Cold War, and not just with the end of the Cold War, but with the Cold War being won by the United States of America and the West. And another narrative is that the Soviet Union would be still there together if Russia and the Soviet Union would be led by different leaders, not by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, or maybe if Gorbachev and Yeltsin would get along better, or Yeltsin would not drink so often, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that the real crisis was at the center. And if it would be for a different leader, we would have today a different outcome. These are two dominant readings of 1991 and situation, and what I am trying to show in my book that if they're maybe not entirely wrong, but they're certainly misleading. And reading the situation of 91 in a wrong way is really very dangerous and really something that has major repercussions today. Because if you think about American adventure in Iraq, it certainly comes from this sense of really all-powerful superpower that can wipe out from the map of the earth a country like the Soviet Union. When we look at the sources, it looks like that the White House and the American administration really didn't want to kill the Soviet Union. They wanted actually to keep it going as long as possible. If you look at today's Russia policies and at the policies of President Putin in particular, again, he looks back at 1991 as something that didn't have to happen. He looks at history as something that can be rewritten, and this is exactly what he is trying to do. In my presentation today, I will focus on three major themes, and those themes will be the role that Russia and in particular President Yeltsin played in the last months of the existence of the Soviet Union. My second focus will be the role that Ukraine played in those events. Again, Russian-Ukrainian relations are extremely important today, and I'm trying to show that in the book that they were at the center of what happened in 1991. And last but not least, look at the policies of the West and the policies of the United States. Hopefully at the end, I will be able to provide you with the quote-unquote right answers of how we should go back to 1991 and how that situation should be really understood. I'll start with Russia. Russia really emerged from behind this colossus of the Soviet Union in the most dramatic way during the events of August of 1991, when President Yeltsin of Russia got on the tank and defied the coup and the coup leaders, who were the leaders, the heads of the KGB, of the secret police, of military forces, and of interior troops as well. And the message that Russian leader brought to the Soviet Union, brought to the world in general, was a message very liberal in its foundations. And it was a unique moment when the Russian idea, Russian national idea, and the idea of liberalism came together and reinforced each other in the person of Yeltsin, but also people around him. Why that happened? Well, one of the explanations of this emergence of Russia is that really the democracy and empire are things that not go easily together. The emergence of Russia as an independent republic, or the republic that had its own interests, emerges really a few years after, through the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, democracy was introduced into the Soviet Union. And what that meant was that it's not only the Lithuanian parliament or the Estonian parliament that started to look, freely elected parliament, started to look for the ways out of the Soviet Union, but it was also the Russian parliament who was trying to do that. And Yeltsin was the leader of that process. The coup was defeated. I came to Canada, I mentioned, on the second day of the coup. By the time I landed, they invited me for interview at International Radio Canada. While we were in the taxi coming there, the news came that coup collapsed. For me, that was a great relief. I could actually tell what I thought about the situation. My family was back there, so I could breathe much more freely and talk freely as well. So the coup collapsed, and collapsed largely because of the resistance showed by Boris Yeltsin. He rose the banner of the defending the legitimate power in the Soviet Union, which meant President Gorbachev. And the idea was returning Gorbachev back to Moscow from his imprisonment in the Crimea. But what happened in reality was not return back of the Soviet Union of the old times. What occurred was actually a counter coup, with Russia emerging, Russian Republic emerging as a winner in this contest. The former Soviet Union was gone. 2 days after the coup, Yeltsin forces Gorbachev to revoke his decrees about the appointing of the key figures in his administration, including the Minister of Interior, including the Minister of Defense, and the head of the KGB, and appointing his own people. So what we really see, it's not just the defeat of the coup, it's also emergence of Russia and President Yeltsin as the main power in Moscow. And it is around that time that Russian liberalism starts to think differently. If before the coup of 1991, President Yeltsin was together with the leaders of other republics, asking for as many rights as possible from the center, by the time he de facto emerges victorious in this competition with the coup leaders and with Gorbachev, his thinking changes. He starts to act in the mode of saving the empire, not trying to get more rights and privileges. He already got rights for the Russian oil and gas already in September of 1991. And it is around that time that for the first time in late August of 91, that we hear that the spokesman for the Russian government, for the President Yeltsin, mentions words like Crimea, Donbass, and Eastern Ukraine. So the threat is made that if the republics decide to leave the Soviet Union, Russia would have the right to revisit the agreements that were signed with those republics, and that the borders that are or were in the Soviet Union would not be any more honored if the Soviet Union falls apart. Well, at that time, eventually President Yeltsin backs off, and this diplomatic kind of accident and scandal was blamed on the poor spokesperson for the Russian government. He was blamed for misunderstanding the Russian position. Why Boris Yeltsin backed off at that time? There were two reasons. One was the position of the United States, who didn't want that to happen, and another was the position of the republics. It is in late August of 91, when Yeltsin takes over really control in Moscow, that one republic after another declares its independence. And it's for the first time that Ukraine appears on the scene as one of the central players in the drama of disintegration of the Soviet Union. because it was on the 24th of August of 91 that Ukrainian parliament declares independence. Belarus follows immediately after that, and most of the other republics, with the exception of the Balts, because the Balts declared their independence earlier. Russian position and the position taken by President Yeltsin in fall of 1991 and early winter of 1991 was really crucial for the fate of the Soviet Union, but also for the peaceful process of disintegration of the Soviet Union. At some point in October, Yeltsin and people around him made decision that in economic terms, Russia can't afford to support other republics, which means continue to have the empire, that it needed oil and gas revenues to focus on itself and rebuild itself. And the model that is proposed is the model of confederation. Really, what we see there is Russia acting really rationally, learning from the lesson of existence and disintegration of other empires of the period of the 20th century, including Britain, including France, because the empires of the second half of the 20th century, they let their colonies go because at the end they did the calculation and it didn't work out. Britain certainly ran out of the money, and from that point of view, it looks like Russia decides the same. There was one caveat, and that was that while economically Russia decided to go on its own, Russia decided also to maintain political control over the post-Soviet space. And this is something that starts and begins already. We consider today this invention of Mr. Putin. This really starts and begins already in the fall of 91. In negotiations between advisors to Yeltsin and Gorbachev, the scenario is discussed where it is said that Russia for now is weak, it has to focus on itself, but 20 years from now, please do your math, they're talking in 1991, the republics will come back. And if they don't come back, we don't really care much unless these are republics on the Russia's borders. And you look at most of the republics of the former Soviet Union, most of them are on Russian borders. So it was an interesting take on that. So Russia goes economically on its own, but not politically. When and how does the Soviet Union falls apart and disintegrates? And that's where Ukraine, for the second time, becomes a very important actor in the story. And it comes in December of 1991 with the Ukrainian referendum for independence, in which more than 90% of the population voted for independence, including in the areas that are now contested and that now are the really battlegrounds in this Ukraine crisis of today. So in Odessa, in south of Ukraine, 85% voted for independence. In Donbas, Donetsk region, which is now taken with Russia's support by pro-Russian separatists, it's 77%. In the Crimea, it was 54%. And the results of the referendum really closed the question about whether the borders should be renegotiated or not. When 1 week after the Ukrainian referendum for independence, in Belarusian hunting lodge of Belovezha, the leaders of Russia and Ukraine meet together, Yeltsin was surprised to learn that the majority also in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine voted for independence. And at that point, that was actually the question. The question was decided. Before that, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others and Gorbachev were saying that, okay, the count of the vote in Ukraine should be taken on region-by-region basis. And if the majority is not for independence, that means that the borders should be redrawn. What referendum of December 1st, 1991 showed that actually 90% overall and more than 50% even in the Crimea. The Soviet Union was dissolved twice officially. All of that happened in December of 1991. So for the first time, it was at this meeting in Belovezha between the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. For the second time, it was on December 20th in Almaty, where the Central Asian republics also joined the Slavic republics, and they signed a document on the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. But the key issue for republics deciding to go their way were the relations between Russia and Ukraine. At Belovezha, there were three leaders, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, but Belarus really served, they provided actually venue for the discussion. The debate was between Yeltsin and Kravchuk, the debate was between Russia and Ukraine, and the debate started with Yeltsin putting on the table a document on the new union, which was prepared by Gorbachev, and asking the president of Ukraine, Kravchuk, whether he would sign it. And Kravchuk said, well, I would love to do that, but you know, we had this referendum a few days ago, and really there can be no union anymore. And Yeltsin's position at that time was, well, if Ukraine is not signing, Russia is not signing either. And that brings a very interesting point. The referendum in Ukraine was not about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The referendum in Ukraine was about Ukrainian independence. The question is why that led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, why Ukraine turned out to be so important. Well, the answer to that is numbers. This is the second largest, or used to be the second largest republic in terms of the population and in terms of its economic potential. Yeltsin, as far as I know, in my sources, twice explained to President Bush the reason why Russia would not sign if Ukraine is not part of the Union. The first time that happened in July of '91, half a year before that, the disintegration. He said, well, if Ukraine is not there, Russia will be outnumbered and outvoted by the Muslim republics. So the burden of the empire, Russia was not prepared to carry on its own. And that almost by default happened that, oh, it's a domino effect that Ukraine is not signing, Russia is not signing, and Russia is not there. No other republic is interested in the Union. So the Central Asian republics, which were very reluctant, they were really pushed out of the door of the Union. Why this story is important today? Because for the same reasons that Ukraine was important back in '91, it is important today in today's crisis. And that's why we see the crisis of that severity. We see the war, we see people dying. The Soviet Union couldn't survive without the second largest Slavic republic. And today, Russia's plans for reintegration of the post-Soviet space would not succeed without this second largest piece falling into its place. Now, let me, which I still have a few minutes, let me go to the position of the United States and of the West. I started my presentation with criticizing the dominant narrative about the American victory and triumphalism in the war. Well, the sources that I consulted, and most of them come from the archive and library of President George H.W. Bush, portray a very different picture. The United States, until the very end, until the late November of 1991, was doing everything diplomatically possible to keep the Soviet Union alive and going. There were some very good reasons for that kind of policy, and one of them was that they felt really very comfortable working with Gorbachev, and a lot of people in the White House couldn't find common language with Yeltsin. They actually hated to work with him, unpredictable, erratic, sometimes not fully sober. So with Gorbachev, they felt that they could work. Another reason was that in the Soviet Union, they found really a very reliable partner in the year 1990 and 91. Most of the issues on the regional conflicts, on the nuclear disarmament, were decided in favor of the Soviet Union. And last but not least was the question of the dissemination of nuclear weapons. The nightmarish scenario that people in Washington and in Ottawa imagined, and Bush and Mulroney were on the phone again and again, and this transcript, some of the transcripts, not all, are available on the Bush Library website. So the nightmarish scenario that they imagined was what was called at that time Yugoslavia with nukes. So a kind of a civil war, or war between nations and republics, on the ruins of former multinational state, with the republics armed with nuclear arsenals, because Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan had nuclear arsenal and nuclear missiles on their territory. And another, of course, possibility was a complete chaos, where the central governments of all of these republics lose control over the nukes, and it gets to the Middle East and to the places where certainly the politicians in most of the countries didn't want them to go. But once in Washington, they realized that the Ukrainian referendum will demonstrate the overwhelming support for independence. And knowing from Yeltsin and from other sources that actually if Ukraine is out, Russia is out as well, it was only in November of 1991 that the United States of America changed their policy and actually arranged a leak saying that the US will recognize the independence of Ukraine, and that was said even before the referendum. But once the United States decided on the issue of independence of Ukraine and dissolution of the Soviet Union, they took the whole question of independence of these republics very seriously. And that was certainly not the case with Russia. In the speech delivered in March of 2014 by President Putin on the occasion of the annexation of the Crimea, Putin stated that back in 1991, many in Russia, including himself, believed that the Commonwealth was a different name for the Soviet Union. It's only, he says, when we realized that Crimea was not anymore within the Russian borders, then we realized what was the meaning of the term independence for other republics. And what we see really in the course of the 1990s and in the course of the last debate is really a contest or debate which is conducted sometimes in very uncivilized manner, including war, over what really independence means and how independent the newly independent republics can be from Russia. What we see in the case of the disintegration of the Soviet Union is not American victory in the Cold War. Again, the disintegration of the Soviet Union never was the American goal in the Cold War and was resisted very late in the game. It wasn't just the conflict between the two personalities, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. That was the continuation of the process that started and began at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the process of disintegration of the empires. Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, British Empire, French Empire, Portuguese Empire, Soviet Union, which I call in this book the last empire, in a sense that this is a continuation. I treat it as a continuation of the last classic empire of this modern era of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And if we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the events of 1991, through the prism of this broader process that has taken place in the world as a whole in the course of the 20th century, and not as something as an accident because of bad relations between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, well, that acquires, that interpretation and the event itself acquires a very very different meaning. The origins of the crisis of today, which is called the Ukrainian crisis or the Ukraine crisis, lie in Ukraine's desire to transform itself by choosing a Western model of development and Russia's determination to stop that from happening and keep the former province in its embrace. To be sure, what happens in Ukraine depends mainly on the actions of the Ukrainians themselves, the same way how it was back in 1991. It was the Ukrainians who decided what they wanted to do. But there is a role to be played by the rest of the world, and the West in particular. And in that role, whatever West plays in the Ukraine crisis, there is a lesson to be learned from the events of 1991. And that lesson is actually unity of the West and unity of Western position as a whole. I mentioned already that there are hours and hours of telephone conversations between Bush and Mulroney. Bush was also on the phone with leaders of other states and other republics, coordinating this common position to the crisis that was emerging in front of their eyes, which they didn't predict, they didn't know how to react to that. But their main goal was really the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. And for a while, we all believed that the miracle indeed did happen, that the world superpower, the communist powerhouse, the last empire disintegrated without really major bloodshed, which put that really in a different category from the disintegration of most of other empires. Well, unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. The events in Ukraine today is really a continuation of the saga of the disintegration of the last empire that started back in 1991. And in formulation of Western goal toward this crisis, Ukraine and Russia in general, the goal, in my opinion, should not be to move Ukraine from one sphere of influence to another, but to reject imperial and post-imperial forms of domination, which should be relegated completely to the past where they belong. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for a compelling presentation on a remarkably important subject, not only from the perspective of history, which is important in and of itself, but also as we try to imagine how to move forward today. There's some wonderful questions that have already come forward, and so I'll try to get through as many as possible. First question is it possible that Ronald Reagan wanted to end the Soviet empire, but that George H.W. Bush got cold feet when he considered the likely consequences? In other words, was there a shift in policy?
Well, this is the first time that I am getting Lionel Gelber Prize, so I'm not sure. It's okay to answer from here?
Yes, that's fine.
Over there? Okay,
Please.
good. Thank you. What happened in the Soviet Union in 1991 was really very difficult to imagine to almost anyone. Even in the middle of 1980s, the goal was really, when it comes to Reagan, to end the Soviet aggression in Afghanistan. The goal was to preclude the continuing Soviet aggression in Africa. So the Cold War was about Central Europe, Berlin Wall, and Germany. So those were the goals that were there at the time when Reagan was in the White House. The disintegration of the Soviet Union was never presented as a goal. And the reason for that was that no one could imagine that this superpower would actually go down or to be disintegrated or fall apart without a major battle with the millions of people in the army, with nuclear arsenals and so on and so forth. So Reagan just was, he was a dreamer. He believed in Star Wars and things like that, but even he didn't believe in something like that happening. The difference between Reagan and Bush administration is that if Reagan was a visionary, Bush was a person who was really very pragmatic in his approaches. So he dealt with the situation as it occurred in a very conservative way. And he was really loved by his advisors, the people whom I interviewed. All of them, they talk about him as a gentleman, as a very considerate person. With Reagan, it was different. Reagan actually would come up with the idea of eliminating all nukes within one day without consulting with his advisors. They would go crazy completely. But in my opinion, those were the right presidents for the right time. All of them, they had different situation to deal with. And I don't think that President Bush would be as successful as the president as Reagan was if he would be there in early 80s. And it's difficult for me to imagine what would be in 1989 and 1990 when if President Reagan would be still in the White House. With Bush, they were saying that, well, this is the guy who refused to dance on the Berlin Wall, which was really very wise at that time, given the amount of a number of Soviet troops in Central Europe.
You mentioned very briefly the question of nuclear weapons, which obviously at the time was a preoccupation amongst Western leaders. I think this is really a quick response question. What's the likelihood that tactical nuclear weapons went missing in the period of dissolution? And is it something we should worry about today?
I watched a number of movies that discuss this possibility, but fortunately nothing like that happened as far as we know. And the chances of this happening today at this point, again, are really minimal. The American and Western position in 1991 was that they wanted nuclear weapons under one command, which in reality meant under the control of Moscow. And that eventually what happened. It was a long process of negotiation between 1991 and 1994 when Ukraine signed a Budapest Memorandum and gave up control, not operational control, but physical control over the nuclear weapons on its territory, which were brought to Russia. So at that point, since '94, I think that the major issue that was on the international arena, what would happen to Soviet nukes, was more or less resolved. Now, of course, they're in Russia, and a number of other challenges and questions come along with that.
You mentioned a brief period of liberalism in early stages of Yeltsin's leadership, which of course has echoes in an earlier moment of liberalism before the Bolshevik Revolution, but there seems to be a difficulty in sustaining those moments of liberalism within the Russian polity. Is there something fundamentally foreign about liberalism and Russia? Is it possible to imagine a more liberal regime?
It is possible to imagine. The question is how likely it is. And at this point, it is highly unlikely. What we see is whatever was left of liberalism in Russia today is under attack. The assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who whatever was his real role in the oppositional politics, but symbolically, that was enormous figure. Someone coming from the Yeltsin's entourage of advisors in the early 90s. So I'm not very optimistic in terms of the liberalism in Russia in the short run. But in the long run, as long as the competitive democracy exists there, at least to some degree, There are major problems with democratic process in Russia, but still it's better than what was in the Soviet Union, let's say in 1980. So as long as this system there and will be able to function on a certain level, there is a hope for liberalism actually maintaining its position and maybe developing and getting more converts in Russia than it has today.
There's a common theme in a number of questions, and not surprising, I think, which is the past prologue? And a number of people want you to tell us more about what your projection is in the likely attitude of President Putin and his advisors over the course of the next few years. Are we likely to see a further attempt to reestablish a greater Russia? How does that affect the Baltic republics? Obviously, anything you'd want to say about the future of Ukraine, there's a great interest in that.
No day passes by without me thanking God that I'm a historian and not a political scientist. It's not easy to write books on history, but still it is easier than try to predict the future. What I can say, again, looking at the past as a possible guidance, is that Russia in the fall of '91 arrives to the conclusion that maybe having an empire and keeping an old-fashioned empire was counterproductive because it drained its resources and it left little resources for Russia itself. And my hope is that at some point the same kind of decision will be made in Moscow regarding these attempts to reintegrate the post-Soviet space, because what we see today with the sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions, and fallen oil prices, they're not falling apparently anymore, but certainly they're quite low today, that it starts to bite. It starts to bite, and the Russian economy is already in recession. So my hope is that message about the cost of the empire and imperial enterprises will be not just received but also interpreted properly in Moscow. In terms, if that message is not received, well, but the goal, the Russian goal, the way how I understand it and why it is in Ukraine and why it annexed Crimea, is that it tries to build its own economic, military, and political bloc, Eurasian Union, that would be, if not on par, but at least able to compete with the European Union and rise in China. So this is the process of creation of a sphere of influence. And certainly it's not only Ukraine, but also Baltic states are viewed by Russia as their legitimate sphere of influence, despite the fact that they're members of European Union and they're members of NATO. So if there is no change of policy and thinking in Moscow, the future for the entire region and Europe and maybe the world is quite bleak.
And I'll allow one last question, which I hope will return to a greater level of comfort for you. It is a more historical question, and it's about the role of President Kravchuk. The question really is, how important was he in this whole process? Was the fact that he was perceived as a relatively strong leader relevant? Would a weaker leader have been able to accomplish the same?
Well, President Kravchuk's main contribution was to the cause of Ukrainian independence and generally to the developments in the Soviet space and then post-Soviet space, was that that was the person who could talk to almost anyone and make unthinkable alliances, like the alliance that brought Ukrainian independence and vote for Ukrainian independence between communism and nationalists. President Kravchuk was a diplomat first and everything else second. And I think that it's the role that President Kravchuk and President Yeltsin played in 1991 that didn't bring the bloodshed and internal conflict and war in the Soviet Union in 1991, because those were the two leaders that, again, they were the key leaders among the Soviet presidents of the Soviet republics, who played their cards well and who were quite responsible in terms of what they're doing. And I guess this is Mr. Kravchuk's main contribution.
Thank you very much. People often think of Canadians as being quite nice, but actually we're not really very nice, because we forced you to do all of this work before giving you your prize. But now is the moment for Patricia Rubin to come forward, and on behalf of the Lionel Gelber Foundation and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Foreign Policy magazine, to provide the prize. Patricia.
So the very first part of the prize is, I'm not quite sure how our dollar is today, but I do congratulate you.
It's doing just fine.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the plaque, and it was certainly well-deserved. And come on, Stephen. Oh, and
Thank you. Thank you. It is wonderful.
thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That concludes the formalities, and now you're all invited to a reception just outside this room. Please join me one last time in congratulating Professor Plochy.